Vice President Kamala Harris is moving into the next phase of her campaign with the Democratic National Convention now in the rearview mirror. The Harris campaign said over the weekend and now raised $540 million since launching last month, with $82 million coming during the convention. Nearly a third of those donations from the convention came from first-time contributors. I started with the idea of joy that the Harris campaign and Democrats are leaning into heavily. We heard it mentioned in a number of convention speeches last week. Talk a little bit about it. What do you think about the politics of joy? You've written in the past about the power of collective effervescence, which is kind of a cooler way to say it, but joy is an easier word, just three letters. Essentially group happiness that was especially powerful post-COVID. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think the sociologist Durkheim first wrote about collective effervescence is that sense of energy and purpose you get in a group when you have a common goal together. And I do think that's what the Kamala Harris campaign has created for a lot of people who, either thought Biden was too old or just weren't energized by his candidacy. At the same time, you don't want to be Pollyanna as a leader. Right. You want people to understand that you recognize the pain and the hardship they're facing. And that's why I would frame this much more as hope than joy. I think joy is about the
hope
energy.
Was taken by Obama, but go ahead.
Well, you could say that, but right. I think in analyzing it, right, what we're really talking about is energy people have around a possible future, not about the present. Right? Nobody's feeling joy around this if Trump wins. So I think that the fact that it's forward-looking means it really is hope, not joy. I think it's anticipatory. I think it's excitement about what's to come. And I do think that energizes people to vote. And I think, we have had a long political, streak of politicians bashing and trashing each other. But I don't want to assume it always has to be that way. I look, for example, at the campaign that Hala Thomasdottir ran in Iceland for president recently, where she won refusing to attack her opponents. Running a campaign based on curiosity and hope and enthusiasm. And people resonated with that. Now, Iceland is a tiny country, but I wouldn't assume that America, which is often regarded as the most enthusiastic country on earth, couldn't operate that way too. And I guess we'll find out as people begin to turn out at the polls. What do you think, Kara?
I think it worked. I think it's fine. I don't know why they have to crap all over joy. It's like they're like a skunk at a garden party. It's like let them have it for a minute. I mean, it worked for Obama. It worked for Clinton. It works. It worked for Reagan, right? Reagan was the original Morning in America guy, right? And he was talking about the future. I think she has pretty definitely talked about problems, right? She just doesn't do them with a sense of shrugged shoulders, right?
Yeah,
she's like, let's go
worse,
forward. Dread, right. It's all, I think the Biden campaign, I was talking to someone again this weekend, and when they go democracy is on the ballot, I'm like, oh no, really? I have to save democracy? I think it's overwhelming and it makes you grief stricken.
Ironically, as dark as Trump was in 2016, I alone can fix this was the overwhelming message that a lot of people heard.
So that was it was a strong man. I can help you. I'm Big Daddy kind of thing. How does he channel it into strategy and policy? What are some effective leadership qualities, positive and negative, you're seeing from both of them, from Kamala Harris and Trump? You were posting about the study about looking at the negative impact of rudeness and disrespect on team performance in other fields. That's all he's got at this point. He hasn't been able to pivot to anything hopeful in any fashion. Talk a little bit about negative qualities you're seeing for both of them and positive.
Well, I think one of the things that the Trump campaign was doing well was attacking Biden on age. And they did not, it doesn't seem like they had much of a backup strategy once Harris took over, and they seem to be scrambling quite a bit now. If I were them, I would probably take a little bit of ownership over weird and say, look, America has always been weird. Weird has been a driver of innovation, has been, a major source of fuel for disruption. And I think there might be a missed opportunity there as opposed to trying to prove, no, we're normal.
Yeah, anyone who says they're not weird is weird. That's the thing. Anyone who's been to high school knows that one, right? Knows that trick. So you would take over weird. They can't. They seem perpetually offended by it. It seems to have hit quite effectively.
Yeah, which is, I think, surprising in some ways. I wonder if part of the reason it works is because it's not as heavy as the other attacks that have been tried.
Right.
Everybody is exhausted by the felon, rapist, immoral, It's like, oh, this is just so much to think about. And it's also just not persuasive to people who are undecided or independent. Because if they thought that, they would have already decided not to vote for him.
Right, right.
So I think there's a missed opportunity there.
What does the word, why does that an effective word over deplorables seemed elitist and rude? And
yeah, it's also just, I think it's not as judgmental. I think that we all know weird people that we accept. So it's a way of saying, hey, you're not like us, without saying, you're less than us.
Right, got that. So one of the things she did, I thought, effectively, it seemed to work when she was listing a bunch of things they were doing, and then she's like, they're out of their damn minds, the way she talked. Talk about that. That was effective, I think. Maybe it wasn't, but I felt it was.
What did you think was effective about that? I'm curious.
Because I've heard regular people say it. Like when you're at work and your boss does something, and you're like, they're out of their damn mind. Like you can feel everybody feels good about talking, and it doesn't feel really rude.
Yeah, so it sounds like in part it's validating what some people are already feeling. And I think it's also at some level, I don't know how far I would go with this, Kara, but part of me hears that language and thinks, okay, we're tired of all of this trying to reason through and rationalize the appeal of Trump. Right. How many articles were written in 2016 and 2017 about, well, actually, it's not X, Y, or Z thing that you hate. It's really, people are feeling, that economic precarity, and, they feel seen by Trump. It's like, no, some of this is just ridiculous and unacceptable. Let's not legitimate it.
Right. Yeah. So what is her best quality, and the one you think is problematic for her, possibly problematic, and the same with him?
Okay, so I think her best quality right now is momentum, fresh energy. I think that's what we're all riding on. I think her biggest challenge is a lot of people don't think they know what she stands for. They're either proxying Biden's policies as hers, or they're saying, I don't really know what her principles are. I don't know what she's going to try to implement.
Yeah, I call it Kamala curious, in a positive way.
That's a great way to frame it.
Yeah.
I do think she handled that really effectively in her speech when she talked about Israel's right to exist, but also how some of the Israeli government actions in Gaza were unacceptable, and how Palestine has a right to self-determination too. I thought she walked that line very effectively in a way that, frankly, very few people have done.
It was, I looked at it, and each sentence was strong, right? So it felt like everybody was addressed, but it didn't feel like she was modulating wimpily, right?
That's how I took it too, and I think those kinds of messages will probably be helpful in the next 2 months. I probably wouldn't debate Trump at this point. I think.
Oh, well, he might not. He's trying.
Yeah, it looks like he's waffling, but I don't see a lot of upside for her. Do you?
I do, because she could get him to say something terrible, like one more terrible thing.
I mean, how many more do we need, though?
I think she could get him to say something very terrible.
Do you really think? Okay, let's assume she could do it.
Yeah.
Do you really think there's anything he could say at this point that would hurt his candidacy?
There are several words he could say about her and about people of color, yes. Everyone's talked about him saying those words, but him saying them in a public setting is a very different situation. It's super ugly. It's like Bull Connor. If you could get him into a Bull Connor moment, that would be effective. If he could say something terrible about women, not nasty women, something worse, and he's called her worse names. Yeah, you could, yes, there are words.
And you think her ability to think on her feet and her prosecutor experience will allow her to debate him in a way that other people have tried and failed?
Not so much. Well, she's good at it. She has the skills, certainly. But I think her very being offends him. I do think what was interesting to me recently is he keeps attacking Walz, who doesn't matter, even though he's totally appealing. But he never attacks her like he attacks Walz. And I'm like, oh, you think you're running against Walz? It doesn't matter. Like, he's just an extra added cherry on the top of this happy fest, right? He's not, like, he matters, but he doesn't matter kind of thing.
Yeah, I think part of his strategy is he throws a lot of things against the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah.
And Walz is a new target.
Yeah.
Right? Well, Kamala Harris is not entirely new. He's been dealing with her over the course of the Biden presidency.
Okay, do his negatives and positives very quickly.
Yeah, well, look, I think one thing that he's doing effectively, and it bothers me to my core that this is effective, is he's continuing to delegitimate all the sources of credibility that would call into question his competence and his character, right? So you can't trust the media, they're fake news. It has created, I think, some lingering questions in the minds of people who would otherwise, in a different era, have said, you know what, we got to move on. This guy is not qualified to lead.
And what about negative qualities?
I think on the negative side, beyond what we've already talked about, I think he seems to be even more undisciplined than he was before. There isn't a semblance of a strategy right now. And for somebody who's as effective at communicating on the fly as he is, you would expect a little bit more focus.
And not rambling. Well, one of the things could be age, and it's interesting that the media is not covering his obvious cognitive deficits. Now, you wrote about President Biden, a column in the New York Times back in July. Shortly before he stepped aside, you talked about how there was a groupthink happening with no one being honest about the reality of the situation. This is pretty common in politics and business, particularly with a powerful or controlling leader. First of all, what do you see as the best way to communicate and get people to see truth or reality? And tell me why you decided to write that. I was surprised and also thought it was terrific.
Oh, thank you. Why were you surprised?
Because you don't seem to go, you're not a limb goer, you know what I mean? Like, I can see George Clooney doing it, but although I was inspired by George Clooney, actually. I was like,
I was too.
This is going to cost you, right? Like, and calling him, Scott and I got in trouble for saying he should step aside a lot. So talk a little bit about why you did that and what's the best way to get out of groupthink happening. I just thought it was an interesting take on what was happening there.
All right, I'll start with the why. So I don't think about this from a cost-benefit perspective. I think about it more in terms of, is this an issue where I have unique expertise to bring to the table?
Right.
And so I don't weigh in on a lot of politics because I don't think as a social scientist I'm adding value there. But in this case, he's making a leadership decision.
Yeah.
And I'm watching him, first of all, fall in the escalation of commitment trap where he's throwing good money after bad and digging his heels in when he should be doing a clear-eyed analysis of what are my odds of winning and how much am I hurting the congressional races down the ticket, which took way too long to happen, in my view. And so I thought, okay, there's an analysis waiting to be done there that actually brings evidence from organizational psychology to the table. I have something to say here, and nobody else is talking about it. And then, in terms of how to get out of that kind of situation, I think that, unfortunately, what you need is a group of people who are committed to principles larger than just appeasing the leader. So if I'm talking to Team Biden back in July, the first conversation I'm having with them is your goal to make Biden feel good about you and solidify that relationship, or is your goal for Trump to lose the election? And if you focus on that latter goal, it becomes a lot easier to be candid.
Right.
I think too many people are doing the political calculus, and this is what you see in the research on groupthink, is people ask, well, is this going to help me or hurt me? And what you want is not a logic of consequences, as Jim March first put it, but a logic of appropriateness, of what should a person like me do in a situation like this? What's the right thing to do? And there's no question there. The right thing to do is to challenge him and get him to recognize the very real possibility that he's basically driving a sinking ship.
So only one person did that very effectively, Nancy Pelosi. And she said it. She goes, my goal is to beat Trump. And unfortunately, our relationship is the collateral damage, essentially.
You had a great conversation with Nancy Pelosi about that. I think she was the only person who did it effectively publicly. I heard from a bunch of people who had private conversations with Biden. I even got one note from somebody who said, I used your article as a template for how to talk to him. I said, you could have just called me. We know each other.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have called me. And I had to write to them in the pages of the New York Times, which was an aha moment for me. But I guess you've experienced that many times. Many times.
How do you get a leader to do that? Because, here you are, you've finally gotten to the presidency after all these years. You do have cognitive issues, right? You're like stubborn as a personality before you were older. And it only calcifies, I think, in their personalities calcify, essentially.
Yeah, my impression from talking to people who were close to Biden around this was that the legacy conversation was effective. That getting him to think about how he wanted to be remembered, and also following in the footsteps of George Washington, who walked away from power, not wanting to take that third term when the people around him were encouraging him to do it. I think that precedent was very powerful. I think, a lot of people focused on the loss message, which was not effective. he did not want to believe that he was not the best person to beat Trump.
Right.
And so reframing that as a gain, and this comes right out of the evidence on how to get people to de-escalate their commitment, was effective in getting him to say, okay, there's actually upside here, right? I can pass the torch. I can solidify my legacy. I can elevate the next generation. I can lift up a woman of color for a shot at the presidency. I think those arguments landed, and that is very much what we see outside of the Oval Office, is if you're going to have that kind of conversation with a leader in power, you have to help them recognize that they're compromised in their judgment, that they're obviously going to be looking for information that convinces them that they're going to win and discounting anything that would lead them to lose. And so I would have gotten him to pre-commit to say, okay, they're a group of people I trust, or they're a group of polls that I would be willing to trust. And if the polls, hit a certain level, then yes, I will step aside.
Right. Now, that's difficult. I was just reading, there was an excerpt from a new book about the Twitter takeover, and a lot of it was about people who knew better, or this was particularly around the blue rollout, which wasn't going to work. And a lot of us said this, like, come on. Internally, that knew that and continued, tried to say it and then couldn't. And there was all these people how to cope with the leader, who was different one-on-one versus in a group where they had to feel dominant in a group. Some situations are impossible, correct? That you can't, because it's their pop stand, and so they're going to do what they want.
It is frustrating how much of this rests on the shoulders of a leader, right? To not only ask for dissenting views, but to prove that they can handle the truth. If you have a leader that doesn't do that, I think you're going out on a limb there. I think the first thing you could do is just say, I'm worried that people are not going to be honest with you because they care a lot about your approval and your opinion. It has real weight around here. Can we do an anonymous poll? And sometimes that's enough if the leader's open to it. I think to your point, it's a lot easier to have trust one-on-one than it is in a large group setting. And so I would try to catch the leader before or afterward. But easier said than done. I think that that weak leaders shoot the messenger. I think that strong leaders praise the messenger, but truly great leaders promote the messenger. And I don't think we have enough leaders doing that.
No, not any, actually, in my experience. I don't know. Anyway, it's a really interesting. We'll see what happens. I do think one of the things I will say about Kamala Harris, having spent a lot of time with her, is she really does try to listen to a lot of opinions. I was always struck by that about her. She'd always have me in and say, what's the worst thing here? What's the, very much like a lawyer would. Like, what can I get hit with? What can I, and it wasn't so much political. It was more like, challenge me so I can make a better argument. It was interesting. She's a really interesting character.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it was. And I was always like, oh, you're fucked on that one, And she welcomed it. I didn't say she welcomed it, but she wasn't pretending it wasn't true. Anyway, that's what good, I think that's what good leaders do, collect all kinds, and then make a decision even if it's wrong.